Hello and welcome to the Fantasy Life Show. I'm your host, Ian Hartitz. Happy Thursday. Now, we are recording this on a Monday, so hopefully nothing too crazy has happened. But regardless, a lot of good stuff on the way, specifically as we continue keeping on through our B week with running back tiers. And what better person to talk through tiers with than Fantasy Life Director of Analytics, my friend and all around baller, Dwain, the Rock McFarland. Dwain, happy Thursday.
Yeah, time portal. We're already in Thursday, even though it's Monday. But yeah, like there's nothing that I love more than tiers. If you guys have read my stuff, you know this. Like the levels I go to, honestly, when I start doing the research in the off season and then I start writing it, there are moments where I'm like, what the hell did I do to myself? Like it takes a while to put these together. Let's just put it that way. But like my number one goal in fantasy is to win. Like I started in fantasy being someone that just loved playing a lot of fantasy football. And so bringing these processes and then just sharing them with you guys. And so, yeah, there's a lot of things that go into how we like to break out running backs. So, yeah. And I love alliteration as well. So tier Thursday, I mean, we could have made it tier Tuesday technically, and then we would have only been off by a day, but whatever, Ian, I will go with tier Thursday.
I just love how, again, we're here to win, Dwain. You play to win the game. No
That's
fun,
right.
zero fun, sir. And let's try to figure out how to win. It's Tier Thursday, everyone. Let's get after it. All right, Dwain. So you mentioned you've written about this already. Everyone can find that on fantasylife.com for free. Pretty freaking good deal there. So you want the full list, go on and go through that. But yeah, man, actually looking at your tier methodology, a lot of work was done here, man. And again, you kind of go through how there's fantasy points, volume, efficiency, age, offensive quality, things that I think we all naturally think through and talk through as we're, discussing any player. But in your case, man, it really is something that you went through each and every player in tier to get a pretty damn good list. So talk about the overall methodology for these tiers.
Yeah, and placing these guys into tiers can be really hard. Like there are times where I'm torn between which one they go in, and honestly, that's what takes me more time than even writing. Is sometimes like making the cut points and deciding where these things go. But yeah, just to kind of give to level set here, I'm going to quickly run through the components of the methodology and why they're important. Fantasy points per game, guys, with every position. It is the most predictive thing to next year's fantasy points. But the way I think about projecting, the way I think about, ranking these players is anytime you're looking at fantasy points, then you also want to look at the underlying things, Ian, and say, okay, how likely is this number to change? We know it's the most predictive year over year, but it's not 100%. And there's a reason why. There are other factors that are in play. And so you want to start to account for what those factors are and really get a true bearing on what we think they're going to do this next season. And what's interesting about the running back position is it's all about volume, man. Did you know that volume, even though we talk about it all the time, well, he's going to get the volume, but he's really not that good. Volume is actually the most sticky thing year over year, more than a player's efficiency. So as much as we may get excited about efficiency, and we'll talk about it in a second, still the coach's trust to get these players on the field and put them into these situations does matter, okay? So routes per dropback, attempt share, target share, all of those things rank right behind fantasy points per game as far as predicting the next year's results. And one thing I want to say about this is it's far more predictive when the player's on the same team, when they're continuing on with the same team that they were on before. Probably same coaching staff as well. Maybe they didn't. You got to look. Did they add another running back in round one? Well, then that would change. Then maybe you shouldn't just think same team is a lock. So none of these things are binary, right? They're all context. They're all layers. But running backs that go to a new team, a lot of the signal gets lost. So something to remember because we have a lot of those this year that we'll be talking about. Efficiency, you heard me mention it. It's still a really good tiebreaker. And the things that running backs own the most are missed tackles force and average yards after contact. The problem is, Ian, when you try to correlate those to next year's fantasy production, a correlation of 0.10 and 0.13. Whereas when we go back to, their attempt share, it's a 0.53. So again, the volume is still king, but we like to look at the efficiency because it can also tell us if running backs are starting to hit a cliff, like if they're falling off. And that really brings us to the next point, and that's age. And for running backs, age is really the most unique at this position because the runway is so short. Okay. Typically, first year guys, age 21, 72% versus their best 3 years of their career, which we'll call their prime. Age 22, they get to 89% of that. Ages 23 to 25, Ian, that is the sweet spot, 95%. of players' prime production came in that range. And then ages 26 to 27 really looks like they're age 22. So you don't have to completely jump off board. Okay. Now there's more of a chance that they take a bigger drop off here versus when they're 22. There's a chance that maybe they're ahead of the curve and they get to that prime a little bit sooner. Then once you get past that, that's really where you start to see the drop off, age 28 and above. But the ultimate years where you got to be super concerned, Ian, is 29 plus. And then the last thing, we got to talk about the environment. You mention this all the time. It is a huge thing. So I looked at the offensive line play, looked at, do you have a good quarterback? Are you on a team that's going to score points? And then finally, what's your competition for touches in the backfield? Do you have a passing down specialist that could really limit your upside as far as getting on the field in the 2-minute offense? Maybe they brought in a banger to score touchdowns inside the 5. Is that going to change the outlook of a player? And then finally, I do look at ADP and I look at underdog because it's the most mature market, but I'm looking at the position level, guys, not the overall. So anytime there was something close, I will lean into ADP because on underdog, we've got thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars that have already been spent on these drafts by people that actually care about winning in their league. So I think it's something that we've got to lean into.
It is funny to me, Dwayne, where, just think about how far kind of football analysis has come in the last 10 years and some of the new cool stats we have that help, quantify what we see when we watch the game, which is fantastic. And I love that. And it helps tell the story. But when you do start digging into a little more with what actually matters, what correlates the most with fantasy points, and it just kind of ends up being good old rush attempts and targets. That volume continues to be a hell of a drug in fantasy land, as is continuity, which I thought was a very good point with that, both with the running back
It's disappointing
team,
in a
the
way.
offensive coordinator. Yeah, it is.
Because we want the new things to be like the new, it's like the new things we study. Like every time I research one, I hope this is like the golden ticket, man. This is the thing. This is the entry to the Willy Wonka, chocolate factory. I get to eat the chocolate bar. I'm going to beat everyone at fantasy. And I'll be honest, sometimes I'll spend 2 days on research and you get to the end of it. It's just like what you said. And I'm like, this isn't even as good as rushing attempts. So it can be self-defeating at times, but we do chase them all down.
Well, and we'll keep trying to do that because maybe, just maybe, Dwayne, we will find it. But until then, we will keep on keeping on focusing with that volume. And accordingly, as we now get into your tiers, man, top 3 running backs in tier 1, I don't think should surprise anyone. Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, and Bijan Robinson. Gets a little bit more interesting, I believe, in this tier 2. So Jahmyr Gibbs, Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley. Had a nice discussion on Monday about those guys. But rounding out your tier 2 running backs is rising second-year Dolphins running back Devin Achane. And looking at Achane, man, certainly has less guaranteed volume than most that are going this high in drafts, typically going around, again, that round 2, round 3 curve, depending on your site. Are we confident using that legit high-end draft capital on him? Because as much as, Dwayne, I want to trust that efficiency, we just said it. Volume is pretty important, and it does seem like Raheem Mostert and potentially guys like Jalen Wright and whoever else could be making this more of a split backfield than we're used to seeing for a guy that, again, we're drafting with a top 30 pick.
Yeah, and this tier is a mixed tier, right? It's prime volume hogs and part-time playmakers. So Jahmyr Gibbs and Achane, they're the part-time playmakers. The guys we know they're going to get the volume, right? Or at least we can project it as Jonathan Taylor and Saquon Barkley. I did think about this a lot. And kind of where I landed with Achane was this. If we look at him last year in the games where we had Raheem Mostert, he got 40% of the rushing attempts. He had a 53% route participation, okay? Right now, in the FantasyLife projections, where, I go through this stuff with a fine-tooth comb. Again, it's like the tiers process. Sometimes I look at myself in the mirror and I think, you're doing great work. And then other times I look at myself in the mirror and I'm like, you're an idiot. You're taking too much time to do this
failure.
Work. Or you just hit a wall where you're like, I can't look at another number. But in the FantasyLife projections, I have him projected for 41%. So last year, again, 40% was where he was at of the rushing attempts and 47% route participation. Last year with Mostert, 53%. So I've got him projected right at basically what he did last year. And he still comes out, Ian, as the running back 13. But the question we have to ask ourselves is this. Are we so sure that we're not going to look up in week 1 and see Achane with a 50% snap share? Look, as soon as I mentioned this, people are like, oh man, no way he can handle the workload. Really? People used to say that about Austin Eckler. Austin Eckler didn't come into the league as a 205-pound back, guys. People used to say this about Jamal Charles. Essentially, there's a long list of running backs where we've said this about them until we didn't because they just proved otherwise. We're not saying it about Jahmyr Gibbs right now. Where's he go?
No.
Achane's really the same profile as Jahmyr Gibbs other than his draft capital, right? And you're getting him around later. So the way I look at this, Ian, is if he just modestly climbed and we were wrong. And Mike McDaniel's been saying this already. He's like, we've got to find a way. Achane's basically forcing their hand with how well he did in his offseason regiment, putting on the weight, coming in ready to get him more looks and figure out how they're going to do it. But let's say, what if he just got to 50% of the rushing attempts versus 40% last year, 55% route participation versus 53%? That would move him and our ranks to running back 4. So again, I think we're drafting Achane, honestly, at his floor, assuming he's healthy. And that's the other part I don't get, and I really want to hear your thoughts on, Ian. I don't know where this injury-prone label comes from. Running backs in the NFL do get hurt. Achane dealt with 2 injuries last season, but he had 1 in college. And the guy handled a decent workload at Texas A&M, an SEC school, and he was hurt once. And suddenly, he'll never last. He'll never be able to do this. So that's the one I struggle with the most when I hear that from the public.
And I mean, I don't think it's not that some guys aren't necessarily more injury prone than others. They get up there in age. And when we see guys have 1 injury, guess what? They are, I believe, more prone to getting injured again. But we just kind of seem to hold it like 10 out of 10 for certain players and 0 out of 10 for other ones. I mean, I'm looking at this right now. Dr. Jesse Morse just went through NFL running backs that have torn their ACL that are active. Saquon Barkley, Breece Hall, Nick Chubb, Zamir White twice. Have you heard one person the entire offseason, Dwain, bring up how Zamir White has torn his ACL twice throughout his career? No, because we just don't care about it with him. Tajay Spears twice. Obviously, Keaton Mitchell, Gus Edwards, Jonathan Brooks, Trey Benson, Marshawn Lloyd. That was another thing when I was going through, reading Dane Brugler's excellent The Beast breakdown. All the attention has been to Jonathan Brooks, and you just start reading about the other running backs, and it seems like all these guys have had a devastating injury at one point or another. So I hear you, man, with Achane, where, yes, I would prefer if he had an extra 20 pounds on him. But you know what? Watching the way the Dolphins used him, it's not like this dude is being asked just to, hey, we need 3 yards and a cloud of dust up the middle here. I mean, I think Josh Norris and Hayden Winks did a great job over Underdog showing, some of the schematics that go into this offense and how they more or less set up like kick returns with Achane and the way they get him on the outside. So love the note about arguably drafting him as floor, because in 8 games next to Raheem Mostert, man, where they were both healthy, 19.8 PPR points per game. That is a ridiculously high number. And God forbid we do get a healthy season. Look, Dwayne, any running back, this is my main point, any running back should not necessarily be expected to play a full 17 games. But look, if we get 17 games out of, say, James Conner versus Devin Achane, one of them is breaking fantasy football. And as much as I do love James Conner, it is not him. So even if it is, a 30, 35% chance that Achane reaches that ceiling, when his ceiling is higher than everyone else, yeah, man, I think that constitutes a top 3 round pick.
Yeah, and I mean, we're being reasonable. We're saying he gets 50% of the carries, not 60%, right? I get it. Yeah. People look at him, they say he's small. You can't give him a 65% workload. Well, I didn't in the scenario I just gave him. If he were to get to 50%, he would grade out as the running back 4 and the FantasyLife projection. So I think you're taking him at his floor. And the other thing you have to think about is there is a chance, Ian, that he gets 60% of the rushing attempts. And no one wants to acknowledge this, but we can't predict what coaches are going to do. We can't predict Raheem Mostert's health. We can't predict that, people are, they drafted Jalen Wright. How many round 4 running backs are we really talking about, guys? Can we just stop? I like Jalen Wright.
To be fair, Dwayne, they did trade a 2025 third for Jalen Wright, which helps a little bit. I hear you though. He's not going to beat out Achane or Mostert. I'm not saying
that. But the point being, no other teams took him. He made it to round 4 of an NFL draft. True. It's not about the Dolphins. The Dolphins were the one team willing to take him in round 4 that we know of. And yes, they did trade away future capital, but all the other teams passed on Jalen Wright in round 3. And that's the thing I care about more, and that's what matters more for draft capital. But as much as I like Jalen Wright, and I do think that he is a fit for this offense, and he's a late-round sleeper pick as well, I think when we look at Achane, there's also this small chance that he suddenly gets 60% of the workload. And if he does that, he will have a chance to be the running back 1 overall, and you're getting him in round 3 of your fantasy drafts.
Maybe Dwayne, the guy that can catch the football and just average 7.8 yards per carry, is in fact a really freaking good NFL running back. Mike McDaniel said the backfield, while it's pretty much led by Raheem Mostert, he quote unquote has spent 0 time trying to forecast that room because I recognize supreme competition when I see it. So yeah, I think again, maybe the most efficient running back we have seen since the Bears' beady feathers back in the 30s can go ahead and win that backfield. I will keep drafting Devin Achane and pretty proud to do it. But guys, before we continue keeping on with these tiers, let's get a quick word in on the lovely Fantasy Life Plus. Fantasy Life's premium product, Fantasy Life Plus, is trying to make you, yes, you listening to this right now, a better fantasy football player and hopefully a freaking champion who can then make fun of your friends into perpetuity. But yeah, guys, whether it's the consensus ranks, Dwain's projections, the utilization report hub, I mean, just so many different tools that we have at your disposal. But the one I keep coming back to is the draft champion tool because, I'm in a home 8-man league with a bunch of my, Chicago friends, and it pisses me the freaking off when they continue to beat me because it's supposed to be my job, and yet I continue to lose more years than not to these freaking goobers out there. So enough of that. But yeah, guys, I love the draft champion tool because, again, it gives me a chance to go ahead, put in our keepers, customize 8-man. We have 2 quarterbacks. Like, wonky settings are the McFarland, you look at ADP, it just doesn't quite measure up right because, again, you have a different league. Well, guess what? With our draft champion tool, you can customize all that, get immediate feedback from, our cool AI stuff that's going to tell you if me, Dwain, Matthew Freeman, even Matthew Berry, what we thought about your draft, where you could have improved, and ultimately, how you did. So really good chance to get free live reps, free in terms of after you bought the Fantasy Life Plus product, of course. But yeah, guys, love the draft champion tool in particular. And yeah, not trying to break the bank here. I believe for a full year with our premium, tier 1, I think it's like $40. And even if you do go priced up to tier 2, still costs less than a Chipotle burrito per month. So in my opinion, plenty reasonable when, again, you're hopefully getting a ton of freaking fantasy success out of it. Fantasy Life Plus, check it out. All right, Dwain, moving along to tier 3 now. Just 2 guys hanging out, Kyren Williams and Derrick Henry, usually available in round 3 of, a good amount of drafts, but you will have to pay up in the round 2, maybe in ESPN and Yahoo streets that we're going to be in soon enough. So with Kyren and Derrick Henry, how confident are you in spending a mid-second round pick on either? Because, again, it's great in best ball land when we can just grab these guys in mid-third, but once we do get in those Yahoo and ESPN streets, probably going to cost something closer to like pick overall 20.
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult. So like this tier I labeled high end running back 1 picks because you're having to take them, as basically one of the top 10 running backs off the board, but with question marks, right? These guys both have question marks. Kyren Williams, really the biggest question mark is he's a round 5 pick. If we go back to 2011 and we look at all of the running backs to go round 4 or after round 3, essentially in the NFL draft, and they broke out in year 1 or 2 of their career. We had Devonta Freeman. What did he do the next year? 18% reduction. He went from 21.8 to 17.9 fantasy points. If Kyren can follow the Devonta Freeman plan, we're good. Here's the problem, though. All the rest of these guys, you're not going to like what you hear. Jordan Howard had a 19% reduction. He fell to 12.6 fantasy points per game. Alfred Morris fell from 16.1 to 11.6, a 28% reduction in fantasy scoring. James RB1 son, Robinson, 29% reduction. Ian went from 17.9 fantasy points down to 12.7. Myles Gaskin, 39% reduction, went from 16.8 down to 10.3. Andre Ellington, remember Andre Ellington? 49% reduction. Yeah, fell from 15.2 fantasy points per game down to 7.7. Now, had they not added anyone, Ian, in the first 3 rounds of the draft, I would feel a little more comfortable and projecting him along the range of Devonta Freeman and saying that I'm super confident. Now, Kyren Williams still gets a good projection. We're still hearing all the positive things from Les Snead. We're hearing all the positive things from Sean McVay. They're still, all the beat reporters are saying Kyren is still the clear-cut running back 1. But the Rams did spend a day 2 pick on Blake Corum for a reason. So that's when those things become challenging to me. The thing that speaks louder for me looking at this situation is an NFL team spent significant draft capital on adding another running back. That matters more to me than anything that they're going to tell me this offseason. It just does. Now, if Blake Corum had been a round 5 pick and they're saying the same things, then I'd be like, yeah, this is still probably Kyren Williams' show. But I think there is enough doubt here, Ian, with Kyren, and can he continue to handle that large of a workload? Like, I think Kyren is still easily the lead back on the team, but we're talking about games last year, Ian, where this guy was at an 80% snap rate. And whenever we talk about size and we don't want to overreact to it, thinking 80% snaps for a guy at Kyren Williams' size, that does become a little bit challenging in my opinion. So I do think that Blake Corum is going to eat into some of this workload. So I would rather be taking a Kyren Williams somewhere like round 3. I don't feel as confident in round 2. So I'm going to stop there. We can hit Derrick Henry separately, but I'm sure you have some thoughts here on Kyren.
Yeah, man. I mean, you said it. It's weird that kind of the injury factor isn't really put alongside Kyren like it is some of these other running backs. And not even
Like
just because he's a
Achane.
smaller guy, but yes,
I know.
exactly. I mean, we've just seen it with Kyren since he's come out, man. Broke his foot, in June before his rookie year, and then has a high ankle sprain before his rookie year can really get going. Fractures his hand last year, had a hip strain that caused him to miss a couple games last October, had another ankle sprain, last October. So, not saying he's
Has already
necessarily
missed time in camp this year. So,
yeah,
yeah.
that's not ideal either, man. So, I do see things like Jordan Rodriguez, who's a fantastic follow out there for all things Rams and stuff. She's saying that Sean McVay, would be Kyren Williams' godfather if, he could. So, no, we're not doubting Kyren's status as, the lead running back for the Rams. But when you add Cora, man, you're not just adding someone that's like going to take a sliver of the pie. It does seem like this could be someone, Dwayne, where it's literally Kyren the first 2 possessions, and then Blake just kind of takes the job for that third possession. So, and then people want to be like, all right, well, maybe adding Blake's going to really open up the receiving upside of Kyren Williams. How much longer can we go back and say, okay, this guy was a good receiver at Notre Dame and just imply that he's still this great NFL receiver? Dead last in yards per route run, Dwayne. I feel like I'm talking about Miles Sanders all over again, where no, I'm not trying to let one stat do all the talking for a complete facet of a player's game, but could you not rank dead last in it among 47 qualified running backs? So I hear you. But again, tier 3, if you can get him in round 3, I do think we saw the upside last year, which is scoring more fantasy points per game than anyone other than Christian McCaffrey. So even, 80% of that, as I know you've done throughout the offseason and said, still gets you an RB1 finish. And that's why he is in tier 3. Derrick Henry, though, certainly does have similar problems as, a Saquon Barkley or Jonathan Taylor in terms of the impact of a dual threat quarterback. That said, we do not see Lamar Jackson used inside the 5-yard line to the same extent as someone like Jalen Hurts. Also not necessarily getting a ton of receptions, though. So I certainly am team that Derrick Henry is not washed. You kind of look at the differences in yards before contact per carry, a.k.a. the Titans offensive line. That constituted a far bigger drop-off for Henry than, again, anything that had to do with his overall ability. But that said, Dwayne, father time comes for us all. He is getting up there. He is changing teams. Thoughts on Henry and how you've kind of been drafting him throughout the year? He's someone where I haven't necessarily shot away from, but, you get through 200 or so drafts and I haven't made a habit of taking him as well.
Yeah, I mean, the question for Henry is purely around the age. I'm not worried about Lamar because of what you mentioned. He doesn't get those carries inside the 5-yard line like Jalen Hurts and like Josh Allen does. Those
Right.
guys, I mean, they're 40 to 60% of their team's offense once they get down there. That's not the case with Lamar. So I think he's going to score the touchdowns. We just saw Gus Edwards last year score 13 rushing touchdowns. So that's certainly in the range of outcomes, for Derrick Henry. It's hard to project him for anything honestly less than 10 rushing touchdowns. And I will say with his efficiency, to your point, a big part of that was the offensive line. And though it fell off from where he was in his prime, really where he was last year in yards after contact and missed tackles forced, it was in line with his 3-year averages. And when you're working with regression, folks, that's really the number you're regressing to. It's not just the league average. You're regressing more to a player's average. That's the better way to handle these things. So there's a lot of positives there with Derrick Henry. The biggest question is he is at age 30. He does have a ton of carries on his body. Is there a better chance for breakdown? But I do think there is enough upside, Ian. If he sneaks into round 3 of your draft, I would be more willing to click on him. I don't want to take him in round 2, but I don't want to rule out the chance that Derrick Henry, that we look up at the end of the year, where we're like, wow, he ran for 1,700 yards because the defenses were so worried about Lamar Jackson, and he scored 15 touchdowns. We know he's not going to be a factor in the passing game. He's just not. He'll catch a few passes. He's not going to do a lot. But I do think the upside and the ceiling case is there to still want to click on him in round 3. I will say this. I'm not doing it if I took Bijan or Breece Hall in round 1. Right. If that's the case, I'm probably still going wide receiver in round 3. But if I went wide receiver, and now I can go Derrick Henry towards the middle of round 3, maybe even early round 3, if I'm in a 2 wide receiver league, then I'm more willing to click on his name.
Pick 18 on ESPN right now. That's a little bit steep, but pick
It's rich.
25.8 over at Yahoo. So, yeah, if you do have the one-on-one, let's say you go ahead and get a CeeDee Lamb and then you're back around the 2-3 turn, you want to grab a Chris Olave and then also stack a Derrick Henry on that, I am more than fine with that. But yeah, preferably, guess what? We want all of our fantasy players at a cheaper value than what they currently cost, of course. But, again, got to be willing to spend up a bit for these guys when there's so many good wide receivers still on the board, especially as Dwain said, the leagues where we have 3 starting spots for wide receivers, that's where it gets a bit tougher to stomach that round 2, round 3 cost. So moving right along, Dwain, when we start looking at your tier 4 RBs, Travis Etienne, Isaiah Pacheco, Josh Jacobs, and Rashad White. I mean, these are guys that we are also seeing in round 2, especially Isaiah Pacheco, and into round 3. So, yeah, it's fun in best ball being able to get these guys round 4, round 5 sometimes. Not in our home leagues, though, where America still does love to draft their running backs quite early. So out of this group, who have you drafted the most and the least? I will say personally, I've gotten the most out of Isaiah Pacheco and the least out of Rashad White. But am I going to be spending many top 20 picks in my redraft leagues on Isaiah Pacheco? Probably not.
Yeah, so this tier, it's like prime running back ones because they're all in their prime. Josh Jacobs technically in his post prime, but ETN, Pacheco, Rashad White, all in their prime seasons with projected running back one volume. Now, that's the tricky part, right? We're projecting this volume, but weird things can happen. The guy I feel the safest about is Travis Etienne Jr. He's still a former round 1 pick for the Jaguars. We saw Tank Bigsby really struggle last year. He could take a step forward and maybe take some of the work. But when I looked at ETN last year, look, he was still 16.4 fantasy points per game, Ian. That's a running back 1 finish. And his utilization profile, though, it really offered 20 point per game upside, but his yards per carry, remember, and the thing that people loved about ETN last year was, oh man, this guy's hyper efficient. He's going to just blow everything away. Like his yards per carry fell from 5.1 to 3.8. But I will say, missed tackles forced, yards after contact really remain in that running back 1 to running back 3 territory. The biggest issue was the offensive line for the Jaguars. They had 9 players per PFF play more than 150 snaps. So they were dealing with suspensions, trades, injuries, all sorts of things. So I think if Travis Etienne gets back a healthy offensive line and that looks better this year, I think you could argue that ETN should be getting taken closer to Barkley and closer to Jonathan Taylor. I still like those guys. They've had a higher demonstrated upside more than ETN. But right after them, I think you could make an argument that really ETN should be going right there with Derrick Henry as well as with Kyren Williams. So he's my most drafted of that group. Second most is Pacheco. Yeah, a round 7 draft pick, but they did nothing, man. I mean, we got Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and now we're getting the Deneric Prince hype again. And now we find out really that's because CEH has been dealing with an illness. So it's probably still CEH, who we know, like, is just not a threat to take a lot of work. So Pacheco, even though not an early round pick, when you look at the rest of the depth chart, it's hard to get it's hard to be too down on him. I mean, the dude averaged 17.4 fantasy points per game from week 9 on, which is the time when he really took over the lead role for the Chiefs. So I really like drafting Pacheco and ETN. The two guys that I've had more struggle with in this tier, even though they're cheaper, has been Josh Jacobs, Rashad White. The biggest thing with Jacobs is the fact that we know he goes to a coach that loves to rotate the running backs. They spent a solid pick on Marshawn Lloyd. They still got A.J. Dillon hanging around. So I like that offense. I like the offensive line. So Josh Jacobs could make me sorry for this, but I have taken him less than the other two. And then Rashad White, when I look at him, yes, it was a late round pick, but Bucky Irving was added to the team. And I just don't like this is the offense I like the least out of this group. This is the offensive line I like the least out of this group. This is the worst efficiency of all the other running backs in this group. So I think he is the one that's on. Other than that, yeah, he's definitely he's on the most shaky ground. He only has the projected volume. Everything else is kind of a problem for him. Now, the competition for touches, I still grade it as low. Like they added Bucky Irving, but again, that's a late round pick. Yeah. So we'll see what happens with that. But for me, that's the order they go in. But ETN, I think, is the safest.
Rashad White is the dead zone running back out of this group because, again, we are only following the volume. Really, nothing else is going, his way. So a better pass catcher than I think a lot of people will give him credit for. He is legitimately good in that facet of the game. But, yeah, certainly has been my least drafted out of this group, and I don't really plan on changing that anytime soon. So only thing I'll add is that with ETN, I don't think – I mean, you mentioned the offensive line was all kinds of banged up. And accordingly, I mean, the Jaguars' yards before contact per carry, it dropped off an entire 1.2 1.2 yards last season. I mean, the next biggest drop off was from the Giants at 0.64. So literally the Jaguars offensive line fell off run blocking nearly double the amount of the other group. And, is that going to change ahead of this year? I think it could. They spent a lot of money, trying to keep,
Yep.
some of their better guys there, made a nice free agency addition or two. And again, hopefully just with the injury guys chilling out, we see ETN get back up, because that 1.2 yard difference is almost entirely what we saw with ETN, going from 5.1 yards per carry to 3.8. Honestly, what kind of happened to him during his final season at Clemson when we saw his efficiency fall off back in the first place? So again, guys, that's tier 4. Certainly feeling better about following the better offenses with Isaiah Pacheco and Travis Etienne. Now, Dwain, moving right along. And again, guys, you can find all these tiers for yourself over at FantasyLife.com. Just go to Dwain's profile. But yeah, tier 7 now consists of David Montgomery and Raheem Mostert. And just looking at these guys, again, not saying that some running backs, particularly more elderly ones like Raheem Mostert, aren't inherently more injury prone. But if we could go in Madden style and just turn off injuries for the season, like, how does either one of these running backs really bust without an injury? Because when we look at the Dolphins and the Lions, two of, if not the single two most fantasy-friendly backfields in all fantasy football. And both these guys sure seem like, Dwain, they're not going anywhere in terms of their team's committee, despite the absence of a young, explosive running back in Jahmyr Gibbs and Devin Achane.
Yeah, this one's pretty simple. Like, these are, if you go read the tiers, it's running back 2s behind ascending talents, right? We're talking about Achane, we're talking about Gibbs, who we've talked about both already, in right. Good offenses, what you just said. Like, these have been two very rich backfields from a standpoint of being able to produce fantasy points. So even though they're the running back 2 and their roles could slightly shrink because they play behind these other 2 players, I still think where you're getting them in drafts, they're very likely to pay this off, to your point, without an injury. Now, I will say David Montgomery is entering the post-prime era, if you will. And then Raheem Mostert is definitely in the decline era. The positive you could say is that he doesn't have a ton of mileage on him. The research I've done says age is the much better predictor of this stuff than workload and volume, where stuff starts to jump around on you. And I feel like you get some noise in the data. But still, I mean, you're talking about 2 guys, Ian. So Montgomery averaged 14.8 fantasy points per game last year. You're getting him late in drafts. And then Raheem Mostert averaged 18 fantasy points per game. So what's interesting is these are actually 2 of the backfields where, like, I love both. I want to take the young guys. And if I don't get one of the young guys, I'm very often targeting one of the other 2 players here. So I think you really hit this one on the head. Like, it's pretty straightforward. Really good offenses. These guys, even if they fall to running back 2 status on the team, we're still going to like what we're getting, given where you take them in fantasy drafts.
Last season, team running back carries, so just overall from inside the 5-yard line. Number 1, the Lions with 27. Number 2, the 49ers with 26. And number 3, the Dolphins with 25. By the way, in dead last, the New York Football Jets, 1. And Breece Hall was still the RB2. Unfreaking real.
Hey, Ian, real quick,
yeah.
Hey, like Raheem Mostert, though, I do have to say, like, right now on ESPN, going pick 101. Like he's going after Jaylen Warren, after Brian Robinson, after Najee Harris, after Nick Chubb, after Zach Moss. I'm taking him over all of those, besides maybe Jonathan Brooks and Jaylen Warren, depending on my build. Jonathan Brooks and Jaylen Warren are 2 of my most drafted running backs. But you could honestly still, even in that case, argue, like, you're a moron. You're a moron, Dwain. Yeah, this guy's older, but he just scored 18 freaking rushing touchdowns. Why are you trying to, like, outthink yourself? Those other 2 guys are in part-time roles. Mostert's probably in a part-time role. Yes, he's older, but he's on a way better offense than either one of those guys. We're talking about the Dolphins versus the freaking Panthers and Steelers. So, like, right now, I mean, Mostert is an absolute steal in fantasy drafts. Like, getting him at pick 101 on ESPN, 84 right now. What is that on? That's on Sleeper. And then on Yahoo, he's a little bit more on Yahoo. Like, I think he's a little bit tougher there. He's pick 70, basically. But man, pick 101 on ESPN is...
Exactly, though. Even if you don't necessarily love Raheem Mostert, like, look across, and this is what makes our ADP tool pretty freaking cool, because you see Mostert going pick 101, and everywhere else he's going at least a round earlier, if not multiple rounds, like on Yahoo. And I mean, Dwain, when you're a running back and you're going later on ESPN than you are an underdog, you know something is, like, very wrong with one of those
So true,
prices. And
so true.
I'm
Good
gonna
point.
go ahead and say it's probably the ESPN one there. So again, with Mostert, still, I mean, every Mike McDaniel quote, man, is pretty much led by we think Mostert is going to lead this backfield again. Yeah, guys, don't think that it's going to go too wrong trying to chase a certifiable good running back getting touches inside of an offense that we absolutely love. So yes, very very great. Zero RB targets. Both Detroit and Miami Dolphins running backs. The answer, yes, take them, draft them. All right, guys, before we continue going on, give a shout out to our friends over at DraftKings. Guys, whether you've been watching your favorite team from the screen at home or the ballpark in the stands, there's an even better way to get in on the action. Check out our partners at DraftKings Sportsbook. New customers who bet just $5 will instantly get $150 back in bonus bets. And yeah, I do enjoy dabbling in the baseball scene, but also, as you all know, fight nights are where it really gets fun. And there is going to be a fun one for free to watch on ABC this Saturday. I believe they're back in Abu Dhabi, and the main event is going to be an absolute banger. Corey Sandhagen versus Umar Nurmagomedov. Yes, that is, I believe, Khabib Nurmagomedov's cousin. So with all that said, guys, you guys know my personal betting strategy of betting on fighters whose last name ends in Ov. I do think Corey Sandhagen is going a bit under the radar, and I'm not going fully on the line yet, picking the dog, but I will say Corey Sandhagen at his current plus odds might just be a pretty freaking good bet out there. So again, in general, certainly betting on the crazy Dagestani Russians who have done nothing else in their life but wrestle and just make life miserable for anyone with the bravery to fight them. But Corey Sandhagen, truly a different dude in that bantamweight decision. Very much looking forward to that one. But yeah, if you want to go bet on that yourself, again, use code FantasyLife, bet just $5, instantly get $150 back in bonus bets. Download DraftKings Sportsbook app now. Again, that's code FantasyLife. And remember, above all else, the crown is yours. All right, Dwain, went through tier 7, Montgomery and Mostert, and then as we continue going on, we get to tier 9, and I think Mostert was a good example of someone where, yes, we're drafting him right now, seemingly for whatever reason, outside the top 20, outside the top 24 running backs, but once week 1 comes around, man, it's going to be tough in the weekly ranks to have him outside the top 12 because, my God, he was the RB freaking 5 last year after all. So now the question, though, goes to tier 9 running back Jonathan Brooks, right there alongside Jaylen Warren. So just Dwayne, let's say Brooks doesn't have the ACL and he's just fine right now. The Panthers drafting him round 2. We fully expect him to be the lead back there once he is healthy. So let's say he is healthy, just magically cured. Where would you think about ranking him ahead of week 1 with the expected workload? Because when I go through it, man, around Joe Mixon, who's RB15, kind of in a consensus ranks or whatever, like I think it becomes Jonathan Brooks versus the Alvin Kamara versus Kenneth Walker, honestly, versus Dave Montgomery tier. For me, that's what I would probably put him at, upside RB2 area. Or do you think there's a higher ceiling here?
Yeah. I mean, look, like if I knew that he was 100% healthy, which obviously he's not coming off the ACL, I would have Jonathan Brooks probably right after Achane. Like that's how high I would have him. Yeah. So I mean, look, it's the profile. You look at Jonathan Brooks. We have the running back supermodel over at FantasyLife that you guys can all check out as well, where I look at all the factors that have been the most predictive for scoring future fantasy points once you get to the NFL level. And the guys that profile like Jonathan Brooks, 48% of them posted a top 12 finish in their first 2 seasons. 71% of them posted a top 12, a top 24 finish in their first 2 seasons. So I don't think it's a matter of if, it's more of a matter of when. Most likely is Jonathan Brooks going to be a high-end running back 2 or a running back 1. The challenge is you're going to have to wait this year. Now, a lot of people look at it, and as soon as you talk about this, they're like, yeah, it's the Panthers. They suck. Guys, Bryce Young was still the first overall pick last year, and they made a ton of improvements in their offense. And a big part on the offensive line. They added Robert Hunt as a guard, and then they added Damian Lewis also as a guard. So they've done things at every position to try to make the offense better. So if we think about the Raheem Mostert, David Montgomery tier as being, you could almost call it the, how do you not rank these guys, close to the top 12 in week 1? Well, this tier would be called, you can only imagine if they ever have the full-time role, we would be ranking them as running back 1s. Or you could think of it as the tier that, oh my God, by week 14 and we're heading into our fantasy playoffs, who are the running backs we want on our teams? And I think Jonathan Brooks and Jaylen Warren are very much in that tier. By that point in the season, like we could be like Mostert, we may like, but we may love Jonathan Brooks. So yeah, I want to be in on both of these players. I'm trying to get one of them, honestly, in every single draft. And I love it when they're on my team as my running back 3. But I'm willing to take them in as my running back 2 and then circle back around for a guy that I know that I can use earlier in the season, just so I make sure I secure this late season upside for my roster.
And the main allure with Brooks, and again, it's one of those things where the injury does exist, so we have to compensate for that at least to some extent. But Dave Canales and what he did in Tampa Bay last year, man, was feature his RB1, that being Rachaad White, more than almost any offense in the league. I mean, I did just study this offseason where I looked at teams and like what percentage of their games do they give a running back at least 60, 70, or 80% of the overall offensive snaps. And 94% of Buccaneers games, which must be, 16 of 17 games, Rachaad White ended up racking up a snap rate north of 70%. I mean, no other offense was above 76%. The Buccaneers, the Giants, and the 49ers were the only teams to give a running back 80% or more snaps in over 50% of their games. So if we get that with Jonathan Brooks, again, he's going to have so much volume, it should overcome the potentially porous offensive environment. And if the efficiency is anything as good as what Dwain's saying it could be, yes, even myself, as we're talking through, is probably underestimated the legit upside RB1 heights that he has on the table, honestly, as early as the end of this year. So Jonathan Brooks, where he's going, especially, guys, if you're in some of these redraft leagues where, you get the keeper that only really carries on for a year. Yeah, that's
take
the
him
time
around
to do
early
it.
in those.
Seriously.
I'm taking him around early in those formats. Yeah.
100%. So good stuff there. Now, as we keep on keeping on moving down your tiers, when we get into tier 10, which is a little bit longer, Najee Harris, DeAndre Swift, Zach Moss, Tony Pollard, Brian Robinson, Javonte Williams, and Devin Singletary specifically. So out of that group, though, I want to talk about DeAndre Swift because out of all the kind of running backs that changed teams a lot and got a good chunk of money, I just feel like I see the least amount of hype about DeAndre Swift. And honestly, I see him landing on a lot of people's fade lists. And it's quite the difference because last year I felt like he was someone that everyone kind of loved at that round 7, round 8 price tag, going to a Philly backfield where, yeah, we thought he was going to be the leader, but wasn't nearly as certain as it is now, considering, he was acquired for some late round draft picks versus the 3-year, $24 million deal he got in free agency to join the Bears. So now he doesn't have to seemingly push his quarterback's tush every single time they get to the 1-yard line. Now, maybe he could actually get some, more running back targets, albeit Caleb Williams certainly still is someone that's going to hold the ball a bit. So what happened to DeAndre Swift, Dwain? Because the guy's still only 25 years old. And I mean, even if last year wasn't the most memorable season in terms of what he accomplished, this does still fit the sort of explosive pass catching archetype that we should be excited about.
Yeah, I think people just get fatigue, honestly, on players to where they've tried it for so long and it hasn't worked out. Like they give in. But to your point, like now yards after contact were down last year for Swift, only 2.4 behind a really good Eagles offensive line. So maybe there's some questionable things with his vision. If you go back to his time in Detroit, you would see those clips of Deuce Vaughn just so pissed off because Swift just didn't do what he wanted him to do. Like, hey, just keep it inside the tackles, run where you're supposed to. So some of the things that may dazzle fantasy managers, like missed tackles forced per attempt and things like that we love to see, there are certain cases where the running back shouldn't be bouncing it, right? Or they shouldn't be making this extra cut. They just want them to get north-south through the hole. And so I think that's a potential concern. Like we've seen it long enough now. But to your point, he does offer upside as a passing down back. When I look at the rest of the depth chart, it's funny how quickly people will tell you there's no way DeAndre Swift is going to get the carries inside the 5-yard line. Like, honestly, I don't get it. I don't know how you can say that. Like, what has Roschon Johnson proven to us? What has Khalil Herbert proven to us? And the fact that when you look at inside the 5 carries, they're one of the most unpredictable stats year over year, except for the guys that have basically had it locked down for multiple years in a row. So I would say that role is wide open in Chicago, and DeAndre Swift has as much of a chance or better of a chance as landing that role than any other running back on the roster, considering that they did just pay him. So when I look at Swift, I'm with you. I feel like people, have probably gone too far. I think the underlying data points are still there. Obviously, we know there are issues in his game. Okay. We just have to say that at this point in the career. Maybe they're not the things that always show up on our spreadsheet. And that's probably the biggest concern I would say that people have, Ian, is that if he shows those same warts and then this coaching staff sours on him, and we know that Khalil Herbert in the small samples that we've seen has been pretty good. And Roschon Johnson didn't really get a great opportunity last year, but they were willing to put him out there on pass down. So I do think there's a chance this like turns into a full-blown committee, right? Where you're almost a third and a third and a third. But projecting it out of the gate, I think DeAndre Swift is the lead back. I would expect him to get around 50 to 55% of the attempts.
I mean, he weighs 212 pounds, man. I'm looking at his player profiler page right now, and his BMI is actually in the 90th percentile among running backs. This isn't some small scat back. You accidentally said Deuce Vaughn. I know you meant Deuce Staley, but like this is not
Oh, Deuce
Deuce
Staley,
Vaughn
yeah.
that we're talking about here.
Deuce,
Nah, it's
yeah.
all good. But
Sorry, yeah.
I mean, and some of these things where, again, the yards after contact numbers are bad. And even because I think yards after contact sometimes get skewed. One long run, you break a tackle at the line of scrimmage. So I like to look at the percentage of carries where running backs get at least 2+ yards after contact. And yeah, he was dead last season. That's not good. But the bottom four running backs in this were Saquon Barkley, Alvin Kamara, and second to dead last, Jahmyr Gibbs. So I think it's one of these things where, similar to a Joe Mixon, we almost are holding certain stats more so against Swift than other running backs that were happily taken, rounds ahead of it. So no, I'm not going out of my way to draft Swift, in every single fantasy draft. But I think the tier you have him in is fair, Dwayne. And honestly, I'm okay having him as RB24, kind of ahead of our consensus ranks. I do think that there's a scenario where we look up in week 2 or week 3 and Swift is getting 70% plus of the Bear snaps, which we have seen them kind of hand over to guys like Khalil Herbert over the years. And then we're just saying, yeah, DeAndre Swift, he's been pretty freaking good during his career, and he's the clear-cut lead back in Chicago. So will that produce, RB1 overall results? I doubt it. But hey, man, you can do worse when the freaking round 6, round 7 of drafts.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, Swift is a guy that, again, he got the money. He has in the past shown the overall skill set. So I'm willing to mix him in. I don't have him on a fade list.
No, I am with you there. So as we continue moving on, we're going to stick in this tier for a second. Already listed some of the running backs, but everyone's favorite game is back. Cut, stream, or marry, Dwayne. We are either cutting them from the squad, we are going to stream them on the squad, or we're going to marry them in real life and presumably, be very happy about having them on our fantasy team as well. So Devin Singletary, Brian Robinson, Javonte Williams. I personally would cut Javonte. I would stream Brian Robinson. And yes, I would marry the artist known as Motor, Devin Singletary. But Dwayne, it's your tier list. What say you?
Yeah, so we're close. I hate to say this, but yeah, Javonte is my cut. I do think people have overreacted. What did we expect last year for a guy coming off of such a gruesome injury to his knee the season before? If you look at the year before that and all of his production before that, like in the efficiency stats, like he did look like a high-end running back one. Again, those things don't always parlay into more touches and things like that. But Javonte has the size, he has the draft capital, all the things we like. But I would go ahead and cut him just because Sean Payton is just a complete wild card, in my opinion, at the coaching position when it comes to running back. I also don't like the Broncos offense. That's the challenge with all three of these. They're not good offenses. But I think if I had to pick one that I was going to that I was going to stream, it would be Devin Singletary. So we're going to go slightly different. And the guy I would marry would be Brian Robinson. And it's very close between these two, but I do like the Commanders' offense slightly more than I like the Giants' offense. And I do think with Jaden Daniels and some of the potential design stuff they can do in the run game, there could be some really nice holes here for Brian Robinson, who can get downhill. He has that, honestly, like that Gus Edwards style to his game. And you've always talked about Gus Edwards and how efficient he was during his time, with the Ravens. And still, I think he's in a top 5 list somewhere that I'm sure you're about to reference to everyone. So I would go with Brian Robinson. I don't think he's going to get the passing down work. I think that's going to Austin Eckler. But I think in an offense where you're having to worry about a healthy Jaden Daniels, maybe if Daniel Jones is fully healthy out of the gate, you might swing me to Singletary here. But I'm going to go with Brian Robinson. I think there's an upside to score, 10, 12 touchdowns, even though I'm a little bit worried about this offense.
Honestly, if we can get Drew Lock under center, that'd probably be better for Singletary because we're not losing as many rush attempts and or scramble opportunities going on like we might with Daniel Jones. But yeah, long story short, none of these three offenses are good. Maybe that's why I paired these three up for the question. Haha, see what I did there. But yeah, Singletary and Brian Robinson is close, and I will say I don't have the strongest lean on marrying Singletary over Robinson. But I think in this range of the draft, man, this really is about where you get your last chance to get these these sort of running backs who, yes, like this is a dead zone running back, but when they're going again in round 7, round 8, and not round 3, you can stomach, getting them on the squad a bit more. 50 wide receivers are already off the board more times than not. By the time you're drafting these guys, don't be afraid to chase that volume at that point in your fantasy drafts. One more round of cut stream Mary Dwain. This time we're going with some more pure handcuffs. Blake Corum, Trey Benson, and Zach Charbonnet. And I was surprised, man, even though I have drafted this guy the most out of the group, I kind of lean towards cutting Blake Corum, streaming Trey Benson, and marrying Zach Charbonnet. I think Corum and Benson are really close in terms of, which one you prefer. But honestly, I don't see much of a chance of a takeover from either. I just think James Conner and Kyren Williams, what they've done for those coaching staffs, they're both really freaking good NFL running backs. Not saying Kenneth Walker isn't, but, I actually saw Nate Tice, say this at Yahoo, and echoes kind of what we've talked about a little bit too with the Seahawks. Zach Charbonnet is just the more when there's, the offensive line blocks you for a 4-yard gain, he's getting you 4 yards. Kenneth Walker, maybe he gets 40, but maybe he also gets you -5 because he's, trying to cut across the field. I do think there's a non-0% chance Charbonnet actually ends up being the 1A in Seattle before too long, whereas I don't see that same opportunity with the other guys. So these are all tier 2 handcuffs for me, which is really freaking good. That means that if the starter goes down, you are likely going to be in that RB1 conversation immediately. So honestly, I like drafting all of these guys, but for me, Dwain, Charbonnet is the one I'm marrying because I think he has the best chance of carving out standalone value and kind of pulling that, Chuba Hubbard from last season, where maybe he yanks away the starting job without an injury.
Yeah, this one's really interesting because, really, the answer is just tell me which starter gets hurt. That's the one I want to marry.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, you did a good job of picking the tier. So I'm going to go the opposite of you. The guy I'm going to cut is Charbonnet, and the main reason why is he's got the younger running back that just had round 2 capital spent on him as well that he's going to have to share the backfield with. Whereas when I look at what we have with James Conner, he is an aging running back. The team could be bad. I feel like by the end of the season, I could be seeing more Trey Benson. And so Trey Benson would be the guy that I'm going to marry in this scenario. But the guy I've drafted the most has been Blake Corum, but is mainly because he's been going after Trey Benson. Trey Benson is starting to come down a little bit in ADP now. But early on, it was like Trey Benson, man, like he's going 20 picks ahead of Blake Corum. I couldn't find a way to do it, even though James Conner was the aging guy. Because the thing we know with Blake Corum, we've seen Sean as Darrell Henderson, whether the name is Cam Akers, or we go back to a great player in Todd Gurley. It hasn't really mattered. And then last year, Kyren Williams, he has shown a willingness to ride one running back for stretches. Yeah. And so if Kyren Williams ever finds himself off the field and we're getting full-time Blake Corum, I think he has the highest ceiling of all these 3 guys. So, but I'm going to still call him my stream because if I had to pick one of these guys that I think has the most outs this year, I do think it's Trey Benson because it could come down to James Conner deteriorating as a player or James Conner getting hurt, which we know happens pretty much every season. And then James Conner, if Trey Benson seizes the moment when that happens, James Conner could return to a situation theoretically where he's not even the starter anymore.
Theoretically, gotta love these conversations in July, everyone. But yes, moral of the story, I think we can both agree. Like draft these guys. That's what I want to do more than anything. So yes, great stuff, Dwain. And again, through 12 tiers, that's your top 40 running backs. But before we get out of here, one last quick one. Tier 13, tier 14. There's 23 different running backs in this. I'm going to exclude Chase Brown because I know that would be the answer. So
I've moved him up already anyway. He's moved up.
You cannot. Yeah. Okay, you cannot say Chase Brown. We are becoming bigger and bigger.
Chase Brown's in tier 11 now.
Yes, we closed our biggest questions podcast with that. So loving Chase Brown. Excluding him, Dwain, who is your dart throw in tier 13, tier 14? That again, late in drafts now, you're most willing to throw.
Yeah, I'm going to give you 2, but my main one that I want is Rico Dowdle. What if he really is the starting running back for the Dallas Cowboys? I mean, it's an offense that we like. We got a quarterback that we like. We've seen the running backs in these scenarios be really productive, even though Tony Pollard last year didn't live up to expectations. Like I like taking my Zeke shares as well, but Rico Dowdle goes later. Even though he's just a journeyman, we talk about it. If there's a chance for him to get the volume and you're getting this guy this late, like out of everyone else we just named, do any of these other here are some of the other names. Do any of these running backs really have a chance to be the starter in week 1? Marshawn Lloyd, Jerome Ford is going to be the starter in week 1, so that's terrible. Ray Davis, maybe. Ty Chandler, no. Kamani Vidal, I guess that's a maybe as well. Tyler Algier, no. Jalen Wright, no. Antonio Gibson, no. Jalil McLaughlin, probably not. So I just feel like Rico's the guy. Yeah, I feel like Rico's got the best chance to be the starter on week 1 in an offense that we like. I think Kendre Miller was in that conversation with him, but the hamstring injury slowed things down. I'll say out of this tier, the guy I've drafted the most has been Marshawn Lloyd, but he goes a little bit after Rico Dowdle in drafts. And a lot of that comes back to we know LaFleur loves to split up his backfield anyway. And then if something were to happen to Josh Jacobs, who is getting up there in touches, then I think that Marshawn Lloyd could be one of those guys at the end of the year that like you like to say, how do we not rank him as a running back 1? I think there's potential, even though A.J. Dillon's still hanging there and could potentially take some of that work away.
2 good picks. I would add Antonio Gibson, Braylon Allen, and Elijah Mitchell just as quality later round darts. Gibson, yeah, guys, I get it. Ramondre is going to be the RB1, but one injury away from actually having that theoretical 3-down ability that caused us to draft him a hell of a lot higher in past years. Braylon Allen certainly seems to be the RB2 behind Breece Hall with the Jets, and right now he is virtually free at the end of drafts. And then Elijah Mitchell, plenty of Kyle Shanahan and beat reporter correspondence tells us that he is in fact the handcuff to Christian McCaffrey. So what better way to get leverage on whoever had the 101 pick, draft the handcuff Elijah Mitchell. And yeah, about 16 regular season games worth of evidence tells us he's an upside RB2 anytime CMC is going to miss time. So thank you guys for tuning in as always. Again, you can catch this full tiers list over at FantasyLife.com that Dwain poured blood, sweat, and tears into. And you can get updated ranks with Fantasy Life Plus. So appreciate you guys for tuning in. For Dwain, for producer Matt, I'm Ian. Thanks again for checking out the Fantasy Life Show. And until next time, take care, everybody.